But Erika is uniquely, even in the midst of that tragedy, is uniquely able to navigate that, even just conceptually and emotionally, something I've talked to her.
This is for Andrew, Kolvet's wife. Was you on the plane on September 10th? Did you see Erika at the tarmac? Did your husband fall into her arms?
It started with a post that wasn't supposed to go viral. No dramatic headline, no warning. Just a few lines quietly uploaded and then quickly deleted. But not quickly enough, because within minutes, screenshots began spreading. And at the center of it all, Andrew Kolvet's wife, breaking her silence. And what she allegedly revealed changed everything. At first, people thought it was just divorce drama, another messy split, another emotional reaction. But then, one name appeared, Erika Kirk. And that's when everything shifted, because according to online speculation, this wasn't just about a relationship ending. It was about what happened during it, what was said, what was hidden, and what allegedly had been going on behind the scenes. The claims, unverified but specific, too specific to ignore, and the tone, not emotional, not chaotic, but controlled, deliberate, like someone who had waited before saying anything at all. But here's where things get strange. The original post disappeared completely, no explanation, no follow-up. But the screenshots, they didn't go away. And now people are asking one question: why did she delete it right after posting it? Because if what she said isn't true, why say it at all? And if it is, then what happens next might be a lot bigger than anyone expected. To understand why that post shook so many people, you have to understand the dynamic between the names involved. Because this wasn't just random drama, this was a collision of reputations. First, Andrew Kolvet, a figure who, depending on who you ask, was either private or intentionally low profile, not someone constantly in the spotlight, but someone connected, and respected in certain circles. And more importantly, someone whose personal life had rarely been public. Until now. Then there's his wife. Up until this moment, she had remained almost entirely out of the conversation. No public breakdowns, no online confrontations, no attention-seeking behavior, just silence. And that's exactly what made her post so powerful. Because when someone who never speaks suddenly does, people listen. But here's where things start to take shape. According to online speculation, the divorce itself wasn't entirely unexpected. There had been rumors, whispers, subtle signs that something wasn't right, but nothing confirmed, nothing explosive. Just enough to suggest tension, and then Erika Kirk. This is where the narrative shifts, because Erika wasn't directly connected, at least not publicly, but she was known. Invisible, influential, and someone who had, in the past, spoken openly about relationships, boundaries, and personal dynamics, which made her name appearing in that post feel intentional, not accidental. And that's what caught people's attention, because when Andrew's wife allegedly mentioned Erika, it wasn't vague, it wasn't indirect, it was pointed. Now, again, those screenshots are unverified. There is no confirmed source, but the language, according to those who saw it, it didn't feel like speculation. It felt like someone referencing something they believed to be real. And that's when everything started moving fast. Because once Erika's name entered the situation, people started connecting dots, looking back at old interactions, searching for any overlap between her and Andrew, public events, shared circles, moments where their paths may have crossed. And while nothing definitive surfaced, some users claimed they found small connections, loose ones, but enough to raise eyebrows. And then, the tone of the conversation changed, because this wasn't just about a divorce anymore. It was about what caused it, or at least what people believed might have contributed. And that's when the first wave of deeper speculation began. Because according to some online discussions, Andrew's wife didn't just mention Erika, she allegedly suggested involvement, not directly, not in a way that could be confirmed, but in a way that implied there was more to the story than anyone knew. Now, that's a serious implication, and again, there is no verified proof, but the way it was phrased, that's what made people pause, because it didn't sound emotional. It didn't sound impulsive, it sounded measured, like something that had been thought through before being said. But then the post disappeared, and that's when everything got even more complicated, because when something like that is posted and then immediately removed, it raises questions. Was it regret? Was it pressure? Was it simply taken out of context? Or did it reveal something that wasn't supposed to be public yet? And that uncertainty, that's what fueled everything. Because now people weren't just reacting to what was said, they were reacting to the fact that it was taken back. And in situations like this, deletion doesn't erase the message, it amplifies it. But here's where things get even more unsettling. Because as people continued digging, they started noticing something strange. The timeline didn't feel clean. Moments where Andrew and his wife appeared stable, followed by sudden distance. Moments where Erika was publicly active, in ways that, according to some viewers, overlapped with those same timeframes. Now again, this is interpretation, not confirmation. But when timelines start aligning in unexpected ways, people notice, and once they notice, they don't stop looking, and that's when the narrative truly began to shift. Because this wasn't just about what was posted, it was about what might have been happening before it, and that's where the real tension begins, because if that post was just the surface, then what's underneath it? And more importantly, why did it come out now? Because just when people thought they understood the situation, a new layer emerged, and it didn't just raise questions, it made everything darker. At first, people focused on the post, the words, the tone, the sudden deletion. But then, the focus shifted, because the more people looked into it, the more they realized something unsettling. This didn't feel like a random outburst, it felt timed. That was the moment everything started to change, because once timing becomes part of the conversation, everything else starts to look different. And that's when users began digging deeper, not just into what was said, but into what was happening around the time it was said. And almost immediately, patterns began to emerge, not clear ones, not undeniable, but consistent enough to raise questions. Because according to online speculation, there were moments, weeks, even months before the post, where things felt slightly off, subtle, easy to ignore at the time, but impossible to ignore now. Like Andrew becoming less visible, not gone, but quieter, less present in spaces where he had previously been active. Then there were small details in archived content, photos, clips, background interactions. Moments where, according to some viewers, Erika and Andrew appeared in the same environments, not directly together, but close enough to be noticed. At the time, nothing. Now, everything. And that's when the first wave of connections started circulating. Users compiling screenshots, side-by-side comparisons, highlighting dates, pointing out overlaps. Now again, none of this is confirmed, no direct evidence. But the pattern, that's what people couldn't ignore, because it didn't feel random. It felt repeated. And that's when the first alleged insider appeared, anonymous, no profile history, just a thread, short, direct. And unsettling. They claimed, without proof, that Andrew's wife had known something for a while. Not everything, but enough. Enough to feel that something wasn't right. And according to this claim, the post wasn't impulsive. It was the result of something building over time. Now, there's no way to verify that, but the idea, it spread fast. Because it explains something people were already questioning. Why did the post feel so controlled? Not emotional, not chaotic, but deliberate. And then The screenshots started appearing, more of them, allegedly showing private messages, unverified, blurry, but widely shared. And one message in particular stood out: "She's not who people think she is." That line, it changed the tone completely, because now this wasn't just about a relationship, it was about perception, about who someone really is, behind what people see publicly. And that's when attention shifted fully toward Erika, because suddenly people weren't just analyzing her connection to Andrew, they were analyzing her behavior, her past content, her interactions, looking for anything that might support or contradict the narrative forming around her. And that's when things got uncomfortable, because some viewers began pointing out patterns, not accusations, just observations. Moments where Erika spoke about influence, about understanding people, about knowing how to navigate relationships. At the time, it sounded like confidence. Now, some believe it sounds like something else. But here's where things take a darker turn, because a voice note surfaced, allegedly from someone who claimed to have been close to the situation, again, unverified. But clear enough to hear one sentence: "It didn't start the way people think." That line, it opened a completely new question, because now it wasn't just about what happened, it was about how it started. And suddenly, the timeline didn't just feel messy, it felt incomplete, because if the beginning of the story isn't what people believe, then everything built on top of it could be wrong too. And that realization, it made everything heavier, because now people weren't just asking what happened, they were asking what are we missing? But then another layer, because someone pointed out something subtle, almost invisible. In one of Erika's older clips, a passing comment, quick, easy to overlook, but now people were replaying it over and over, because in that clip, she says something about people not realizing when they're being influenced. At the time, it sounded general, now it felt specific. And that's when the conversation reached a new level, because now it wasn't just about events, it was about intention, and whether or not certain things were happening without people fully realizing it. But again, nothing confirmed, just patterns, just speculation, just questions, and a growing sense that something wasn't adding up. Because if this situation is exactly what it appears to be, then why do so many pieces feel slightly off? And if it's not, then what are we actually looking at? Because at this point, one thing is clear. This isn't just a divorce story anymore. It's something else, something deeper, something that hasn't fully come into the light yet. But just when people thought they were getting closer, a new detail surfaced. And this time, it didn't just add to the story, it changed it completely. The shift didn't come from a new post, it didn't come from Erika, it didn't even come from Andrew. It came from something far more unsettling, a pattern people almost ignored, because while everyone was focused on what Andrew's wife allegedly said, a smaller group started focusing on something else entirely: consistency, or rather the lack of it. And that's when everything escalated, because according to online speculation, the story wasn't just incomplete, it was changing, not dramatically, not in obvious ways, but subtly. Quiet adjustments, small differences in how details were being discussed across platforms, and that's what made people stop. Because when a story shifts, even slightly, it raises a question. Is it evolving naturally or being adjusted? But here's where things get strange. A longer version of the original screenshot allegedly surfaced, not widely, not confirmed, but enough for people to compare, and according to those who saw it, the tone was different, more detailed, less restrained, suggesting that what initially spread might not have been the full message. Now, again, this is unverified, there's no confirmed original, but the idea, it spread fast, because it explains something people couldn't ignore. Why did the post feel so controlled, and yet so incomplete? And that's when the second wave of insider claims appeared. Multiple accounts, all anonymous, all unverified, but strangely similar. Each one suggesting that the situation wasn't as simple as it looked, that there were layers, conversations that hadn't been made public, and dynamics that weren't visible from the outside. Now, these could all be fabricated or influenced by each other. But the consistency, that's what made people listen. Because when multiple sources, even unreliable ones, tell similar stories, it creates tension. And that tension, it was building fast. But then, something happened that no one expected. A clip resurfaced, old, months back, possibly longer. Erika, in a casual setting, laughing, relaxed, unaware that this moment would later be analysed. And in that clip, she makes a comment, short, almost throwaway, but now it felt different because she says something about people only seeing what you let them see. At the time, it sounded like confidence. Now, some believe it sounds like a strategy, and that single sentence, it reignited everything because suddenly, the narrative wasn't just about events, it was about perception, about control, about whether or not what people were seeing was the full picture. And that's when things took a darker turn, because attention shifted again, back to Andrew's wife, specifically her silence. Because after that initial post, there was nothing, no clarification, no follow-up, no explanation, just absence. And in situations like this, silence doesn't neutralize the story, it amplifies it. Because people start asking, why hasn't she said anything else? Was she advised not to? Did she regret posting? Or did she say enough already? And that uncertainty, it made everything heavier. But then, a new claim surfaced. And this one more detailed than the others. Allegedly from someone who claimed to have known Andrew personally. Again, unverified, but specific. They suggested that the relationship had been unstable for longer than people realized, that there were moments where things didn't make sense, changes in behavior, shifts in communication. Now, that could describe any relationship. But in this context, it felt connected, and that's when the timeline started being rebuilt, not officially, but obsessively. Users comparing dates, events, moments where Andrew appeared distant, moments where Erika appeared more visible in certain circles. Again, nothing concrete, but enough to keep people watching. Because once you start seeing patterns, you can't stop looking for them. But here's where everything becomes even more unstable. Because a new detail emerged. And not from a post, not from a clip, but from absence. Certain older content linked to this timeline began disappearing. Not everything, just specific pieces, moments people had referenced, moments that were being used to build the narrative. Now, that could be coincidence or routine cleanup. But the timing, it raised questions. Because it happened right when those clips were gaining attention, right when people were connecting dots. And that's when suspicion reached its peak. Because now it didn't feel like random chaos anymore, it felt curated, or at least influenced. And that changes everything, because if information is being shaped, then the story we're seeing might not be the full one, but then the biggest escalation yet, a single sentence, posted, then deleted, from an account no one could trace. In it read, "You're looking at the outcome, not the reason." That line, it shook everything because it suggests something deeper, a cause, a motive, something underneath everything we've been analysing. And that's when the narrative shifts again. Because now, this isn't just about what happened, it's about why it happened. And that question, it's far more dangerous. Because once you start asking why, you stop accepting surface-level answers. And that's exactly where this story is heading, because just when it seems like we're getting closer, another detail surfaces. And this time, it doesn't just complicate things, it turns the entire story upside down. Up until this point, everything seemed to point in one direction, A strained marriage, a sudden post. A name, Erika Kirk, pulled into the center of it all, and a growing belief that something had been happening behind the scenes. But then, a detail surfaced that changed everything. Because according to online speculation, the story might not be about what people think it is. It might not be about Erika entering the situation. It might be about what was already there before she was ever mentioned. That's when the twist hit. Hard. An anonymous account, again completely unverified, posted what they claimed was a corrected timeline, not a reaction, not an opinion, just a sequence of events, dates, moments, connections. And according to those who analysed it, the timeline didn't support the narrative people had been building. It disrupted it. Because in this version, the tension between Andrew and his wife allegedly existed long before Erika's name ever appeared, not publicly, but privately, and gradually, over time. Now, that doesn't prove anything. Relationships are complex, but it introduces a new possibility. What if Erika wasn't the cause? What if she was just the trigger, or worse? What if she was just the visible part of something much deeper? But here's where things get even more unsettling, because the same account claimed something else, something that changed the tone completely. They suggested, again without proof, that Andrew's wife may have known more than she initially revealed. Not everything, but enough. Enough to make that post feel less like exposure and more like a decision. Now, that's a serious claim, and there's no verification. But it explains something people couldn't ignore. Why did the post feel so controlled, so measured? Almost like it was meant to say something, without saying everything. And that's when the narrative fractured. Because now there weren't just two sides, there were multiple possibilities. Each one slightly different. Each one supported by different interpretations. And none of them fully aligned. But then, another twist, because a voice note surfaced, clearer than the others, still anonymous, still unverified, but confident. The voice didn't accuse, didn't defend, they just said one thing. You're assuming she's reacting, but what if she's redirecting? That line, it changed everything, because it suggests something very specific, that the post wasn't just emotional, it was strategic, a way of shaping the narrative, of controlling where attention goes. Now again, this is speculation, but once that idea enters the conversation, it's hard to ignore because it makes you look at everything differently. The timing, the wording, even the deletion, and suddenly, it doesn't feel like a mistake, it feels intentional. But here's where things take a darker turn. Because people began revisiting Erika again, not just her connection to Andrew, but her behavior, her patterns, and something stood out. According to some viewers, Erika has always been very aware of perception, of how things appear, of how narratives are formed. Now, that could be normal, public figures are careful, but in this context, it felt relevant, because if multiple people in this situation are aware of narrative, then what we're seeing might not be the raw truth, it might be versions, carefully shaped, carefully presented. And that's when the biggest question emerged. What if everyone involved is telling part of the truth, but no one is telling the full story? Because if that's the case, then everything we've been analysing is incomplete. But then something happened that no one expected. The original screenshots, the ones that started everything, different versions began circulating, slightly altered, different cropping, different phrasing, not drastically, but enough to raise suspicion. Because now people weren't just questioning the story, they were questioning the evidence itself. And that's when everything started collapsing. Because when the foundation becomes unstable, nothing above it holds. But one thing remained constant, the feeling that something important had been revealed, even if we don't fully understand what it is yet. Because at this point, it's not just about what happened, it's about what's being presented as what happened. And those two things, and they might not be the same. And just when it felt like the truth was getting closer, everything fell apart. And then the story broke, not in a clean way, not with answers, but in fragments, conflicting pieces, contradictions, versions of events that refused to align. Because just as people thought they were getting closer to understanding what really happened, everything started unraveling. Clips disappeared, not all of them, just the ones people kept referencing, the ones used to build timelines, the ones that seemed important. Now, that could be coincidence or routine cleanup. But the timing, that's what made people uneasy. Because it happened right when the pressure was building, right when the questions were getting harder, and then the screenshots changed, not drastically, but enough, different crops. Slight variations in wording, missing lines that some users claimed they saw before, and suddenly, no one could agree on what the original even looked like. That was the moment everything collapsed, because when the evidence itself becomes unstable, the story loses its structure, and all you're left with is confusion. But here's where things get even more unsettling, because in the middle of that confusion, silence took over. Erika? No statement, no response, nothing. Andrew? Still absent. Charlie? Never spoke. And Andrew's wife? Gone from the conversation completely. No follow-up, no clarification, just disappearance. And that silence? It wasn't calming anything down. It was making everything louder, because when no one speaks, people fill in the gaps themselves, and those gaps, they were getting bigger. But then, a message appeared. No account history, no identity, just a single line that spread quickly before vanishing. You're arguing about the story, not why it changed. That line, it hit differently, because it didn't focus on what happened. It focused on how the narrative evolved, and suddenly that became the center of everything, because if the story changed, then something influenced that change. But what? And who? And that's when people started looking at the entire situation differently, not as a single event, but as a sequence, a progression, from silence to exposure to deletion to confusion. And that sequence, it felt structured. Now again, this is speculation, but the pattern, hard to ignore, because it suggests something wasn't just happening, it was unfolding in stages. And maybe not all of those stages were accidental, but here's the part that made everything feel unstable. A full breakdown surfaced, everything compiled, every version, every clip, every timeline, put together in one sequence. And when you watch it like that, something feels off, not obviously, but consistently, like the story keeps trying to settle, but never does, like it gets close to clarity, then pulls away. And that feeling, it lingers, because it suggests something deeper, something unresolved, because at this point, we don't just have missing answers, we have missing pieces. And those pieces, they might be the most important part of all, because sometimes the truth isn't hidden by what you see, it's hidden by what disappears. And right now, a lot has disappeared. The only question is, was it ever meant to stay? So now, step back for a second. Look at everything again. In a deleted post that spread faster after it disappeared, screenshots that don't fully match, clips that surfaced, then vanished, voices that spoke, and then went completely silent, and a story that somehow became more confusing the deeper you looked, because after everything, every alleged message, every timeline, every breakdown, we're still left with the same problem. Nothing fully lines up. And maybe that's the point, because if this were simple, it would be over. A statement, a denial, a clear version of events. But that never happened. Instead, we got fragments, pieces of a narrative that feel connected, but never completely fit together. And that raises a question most people aren't asking. What if this story isn't broken? What if it's being held together just enough to keep you from seeing the full picture? Because think about it. And if you were in that position, and there were details you didn't want fully exposed, would you stay silent, or would you let just enough out to control how the rest is interpreted? Because right now, that's exactly what this feels like. Not a full reveal, not a complete cover-up, but something in between, a controlled leak. And that's what makes it dangerous, because it means what we're seeing might not be the truth, just a version of it. And maybe not even the most important version. So the real question isn't what happened between Andrew, his wife, and Erika. It's this: what are we not being shown? Because when stories like this don't resolve, they don't just disappear, they settle, they fade into the background, and whatever truth was there stays buried under confusion, unless someone keeps looking. So now it's your turn. Go back. I watch everything again, not just the obvious parts. Look at what changed, what disappeared, what doesn't quite make sense. Because sometimes the truth isn't in what people say, it's in what they stop saying. And once you notice that, you won't be able to ignore it